on YouTube, right? There are lines that get crossed, people get demonetized and things like that. But it does in some ways seem like there's a lot more latitude there to speak.
There is. These companies are still, they're companies, they're corporations, so they have their own boundaries of what they're sending traffic to and what they're allowing or not. There are still often red lines of what people cannot absolutely talk about in some of these ways. And as I've been thinking through, this is not so much a issue in the propaganda model, but something I've been thinking through in this class with my students about borders is that we've certainly seen digital entities become a kind of border themselves, right? Like there are periods of time where it's very easy for the capital and the technology to cross borders, much easier than humans to cross borders. And so you had probably, I don't know, 10, 12 years of Facebook just sort of kind of operating in every country on Earth and being able to move resources and have people around them. Then world events happen where different governments force them to create borders. So after 2016, when there was, I think, much more than needed that then had an effect, but a lot of worry about, quote unquote fake news and also interest around advertising. The US government said to Facebook, hey, you have, or maybe it was a little before 2016, hey, you have to make sure these ads are from the United States. They can't be from Russia. And this ties into like worry about Russia. So Facebook says, all right, like you need to do these things to be able to advertise political ads or not, to have political content and to sell political ads. Well, what is political? That itself is like a very subjective, very political thing. And so in a way, Facebook then becomes a border for the United States against Russia. And it has an effect on US-Russian relations, but it also means maybe people who are undocumented, who are running campaigns, just off their credit card. Or off of Venmo or something like that, they now can't run that campaign because they don't have proof that they're a United States citizen. Twitter, would under Elon Musk, are they letting this country or that country? I think it happened in India, muting certain words or muting certain kinds of news. And so even though the platforms do allow for like a lot more individual expression than mainstream news does, and this is extremely, I've been thinking about this a lot, the case in Gaza, where there's really only Al Jazeera, mostly Al Jazeera Arabic, a little bit of Al Jazeera English, but nobody else has been on the ground. And so I've been getting a lot of my news from journalists that I'm following who are living in Gaza. And so there's like lots of possibilities for that. But the state of Israel has also just made it illegal, as I understand it, to consume, quote unquote terrorist or subversive material, even as a viewer. So the person I'm currently allowed to, like Hind Quderi or any of these fantastic journalists that I'm watching from the United States, people in the West Bank might not be able to. And someday in the United States, maybe we won't be able to. I'm sure there are people who are really considered by the State Department or the federal government to be terrorists or whatnot, who like they're not allowed onto these platforms. And so the platforms themselves can do a lot of policing, and as can really be seen in Palestine right now, once this law goes into effect, it actually becomes like kind of a surveillance net to catch a lot of people, which is both to that will that'll come to in two filters, which is both meant to punish those people, but to scare everyone else into submission.
Yeah, of course, Israel has banned Al Jazeera, and we're also seeing these videos of people being approached, Palestinians being approached by the police in Israel for posting sympathetic messaging on social media, sympathetic to Palestinians messaging on social media. Any gesture of support, people are having police officers knock at their door and threaten them with arrest or actually arrest them as a consequence of just using the social media. It's really a remarkable thing to be witnessing and to have our government be silent on. But I don't want to hold you up from getting to the third point out of 5 here.
Yeah. So the third is sourcing. Who is going to be in the stories? And this is maybe the best place to talk about Goldberg, because it's not just the sourcing of who you talk to in your story, but who is going to survive through the process to be making decisions about the sourcing. So media tends to really subsidize itself by who it's talking to. So it's much cheaper, for example, rather than to pay a field journalist to go out and find information about how many people are dying in a war or in Gaza, to take the information from a government minister. And it's cheaper than making a data graph That's probably not the best example because they don't have the resources to do anything right like that out of Gaza right now. But you certainly see this a lot with the defense industry, right? Like Boeing will say, we're trying to sell a new F whatever jet. I forgot the number we're up to now, the last one that was like costing like $100 billion or whatever. And so they'll just like hand a video to a journalist and they pay it because CNN is like, hey, we have jets flying around. This would cost a lot of money for us to like get our own jet to fly next to their jet to get. So we'll just take the video copy from them. And as I've talked about on the pod before, I really saw this enacted most in my own reporting when I was writing about the story of Michael Johnson, this young man who is arrested and eventually sentenced to 30 years in prison. But the original story, the reason why my editor noticed it and sent me to investigate it, was just relaying a prosecutor's talking points. And sadly, this happens a lot. The source is only the police saying this person is accused of doing X. And so they'll list all these details, including the person's name, very personal information about them, all the charges that are about them. They legally have to say something like allegedly, but they can show their mugshot. And so often the news is actually literally, there are cases, people have studied this, like literally upwards of 95% of the copy is just cut and paste from what the prosecutor said. So those kinds of sources.
Michael Johnson, just to refresh people's memory, was the man who was charged with criminally spreading HIV, right?
Yes. And he's a very central person in my book, The Viral Underclass. And so that all began with like a prosecutor's press release. And so much journalism is just copy and paste from press releases, from corporations, from prosecutors, from different kinds of companies. And some of that is laziness. A lot of it's economic pressure, as newsrooms in mid-sized cities go from 100 reporters to 2 or 1 or something like that. They're really reliant upon this, but there are all kinds of judgments we make about who we're going to bring in, right? So Jeffrey Goldberg was a Israeli occupation force prison guard at one point, and Wolf Blitzer used to be the spokesperson for AIPAC, I believe. Mm-hmm. And so they're going to have like a very different Rolodex of who they're calling and who they're bringing in. Some by choice, sometimes by necessity. Democracy Now! Is the only show I've consistently been watching that every day they have people from Gaza. There are days where they can't get people because the telecom has been turned off, but for the most part, they have people in Gaza. Very, very few shows do. And I just gave my students I'm forgetting who the author was, but it was a 972, which is kind of a progressive Jewish publication, and someone who did like a really in-depth quantitative analysis of who's commissioned to write about Palestinians. They looked at the Washington Post and the New York Times over 50 years, and I think it was 1.4% of the pieces were written by Palestinians. And then
1.4%?
Yes. I think that's right. And then they did one of Newsweekly's. They did Newsweek, I think it was Newsweek in the Nation, and there it was about 10% over 50
golly
years.
Gee.
And so like the vast majority are like people in the United States are simply not hearing from people in Palestine. Some of those pieces are sympathetic to Palestinians, but written by people who are not Palestinian. But overwhelmingly, they were written by people who are hostile to Palestine. And so an editor has a real big role in that kind of sourcing, right? And what Lewis's book is so brilliant, my friend who was telling you about who got fired because they wrote about not being objective, they were very thoughtful and thinking about, well, who gets to, be told that they're not affected by things so they can be the objective voice. And it's people who are already benefiting from the status quo. So the New York Times has had, it's been all over the place in terms of what they've published, but they have had a lot of pieces about trans people that are not written by trans people. And this doesn't mean that you're like even though I can be sometimes, but it doesn't mean that you're like a raging polemicist when you're doing this reporting. But like Lewis talks in such a beautiful way about he was recruited at WBEZ, the local NPR station here, when he was finishing school, to do a fellowship that was trying to augment underrepresented voices. And then as soon as he arrived there, they said, you cannot report on the trans community. You're not, you are disqualified from it. So it's like, well, what's the point of sort of diversifying it if you don't want to have people bring in those perspectives. And people, they might make different choices about sourcing. I'm very conscious when I write about HIV. It's like I want to talk to people who are living with HIV. When I wrote about monkeypox, MPX, I wanted to talk about either people. I did talk to people who'd had it, and then I also wanted to talk to the people who are most likely to be affected by it, because we have an insight about, just to be very blunt, like the ways that was transmitting through gay sex. And that's a knowledge base that's useful for the rest of us who are vulnerable, also for the wider public to hear from. And so sourcing just like creates different kinds of questions, but it also means who might be disqualified as well. So the Palestinian legal activist Noor Erekat, I've now read this, everything I'm saying about Palestine, like I've now seen it a dozen times or more, but she was the first person sort of in my outer, we don't know each other, but I'd say, we're sort of in my outer social circle because we know people in common. She was the first one I saw saying, oh, she kept getting booked for shows and canceled or recording and not having them air. And so like, she's a very, very, she's written a book. She's a leading legal scholar. She's the kind of person that should be on these shows. But you'll see the same people who don't know anything. If we even had here at Northwestern University, the Times ran a story about quote unquote anti-Semitism on campuses. It's really about anti-Zionism. But they interviewed one student who's 18 years old, and I don't blame them for answering the call of being asked by the New York Times, but they like sort of hang the whole question of this on an 18-year-old who's not an expert on genocides, is not an expert on Israel-Palestine. They kind of create a person that's going to source everything through. And there's a lot of editorial power in who you choose to put in those roles.
Yeah, I want to just second what you said about Nora. She's incredible. I hope to get her on the show soon. I just saw a clip of her in a BBC anchor, I guess one of the few interviews that they did not cancel and did decide to air of hers. And she is just so comprehensive and so persuasive and so forceful and so rooted in fact and actuality that it's just, I maybe we'll put a clip of it here. I really encourage people to go and watch that interview and everything basically she's putting out, and to follow her on Twitter if you're not doing so already.
Let's return now to Israel's war on Hamas. Joining me now is Noor Erekat, a human rights attorney and associate professor at Rutgers University in New Brunswick. She's served as legal counsel to the US House of Representatives and as a legal advocate for Palestinian refugee rights at the United States. Thanks very much for joining us. We've just seen Antony Blinken, US Secretary of State, finish his second trip to the region. Huge diplomatic efforts going on at the moment. In terms of the influence of US in all of this and what he's been able to achieve, how do you think he's going? And we heard from Mark Lowen just now talking about how Netanyahu is now considering what he called little tactical pauses to allow aid in. Do you think that would have been down to Antony Blinken?
I think that it's universally agreed that there is a consensus that the Secretary Blinken's recent visit to the region is a blunderous failure. All the United States has done has given a green light to Israel, a nuclear power, the only nuclear power in the Middle East, to pummel a besieged population of 2.2 million Palestinians. We are on day 32, where over 10,000 Palestinians have been killed, 16 hospitals have been destroyed, where Israel recently even shot, after denying fuel to the hospitals, shot the solar panels on the Al-Auda hospital, has not achieved any of its military objectives. Your last guest was saying that this is the beginning of war. This is not a war, nor is it a war against Hamas. This is a genocidal campaign targeting the Palestinian people, attacking the conditions of life with the intent to diminish their ability to survive. This is a violation of the Genocide Convention. Secretary Blinken has demonstrated a failure in leadership, and we are now seeing that the United States is about to shift precisely because they're putting the world on the edge of a regional war.
Well, Israel obviously denies what your accusations there of genocide, and we've heard them talk about how Hamas waged.
So, okay, now we're up to what? Number
Flak.
4.
Yes.
Flak.
Number 4. Flak.
Yeah, and this is the one that you had tweeted about initially that caused us to reach out to each other.
So Flak is the most personally painful, but the most fun to talk about in a way too. So Flak means when you step out of line, the system comes and cracks your head open. So Flak is when the system senses that you have said something you shouldn't have and comes to crack your head in. And we are seeing this in so many levels right now, right? Like we can talk about it at the level of journalism as a subject and also journalism as an employee, but we're seeing it in all kinds of domains of speech right now. That people are saying the wrong thing and they're being severely punished for it. So you had a New York Times writer, Jasmine Hughes, who signed a letter. I also signed Writers Against, I'm forgetting the acronym, Writers Against Gaza, but it was sort of a grassroots effort amongst mostly freelance journalists. But she signed it, and she was summarily, quote unquote, resigned. It sounds like forced out at the New York Times because that violated a policy. And the Times people, if you watch them on Twitter, like they make fun of activists all the time. For some reason, not being an activist or even making fun of activists is an objective position, but signing a letter is a subjective position. So other people see this happen, and the point of it is not just to punish Hughes, it's to tell everyone else this will happen to you if you do it as well. And so we're seeing that at universities. The Poetry Foundation, a writer that I follow, Josh Trainen, he had a poem, he had a 3,500 word piece about a work of poetry taken out because it only partially, I think in a couple of paragraphs, talked about, an anti-Zionist poem in the piece. Our colleague at Viet Thanh Nguyen, who was supposed to speak at the 92nd Street Y, had his invitation taken out because he'd signed a letter. And so all of this is like meant to, punish that person, but it's really about bringing the person into the public square and using them as a shaming technique for everyone else. And I've gone through this very publicly a couple of times, once privately and once extremely publicly. The first was the first time I wrote about Israel and Palestine, and I didn't actually think it was that polemical a piece. I didn't intend it to be an opinion piece in any way. Was when a colleague of mine, a photographer, had heard when we were both at the Village Voice, had heard a story and he wanted to photograph it. We worked on it together. We did a few stories together that way. And it was about a young woman named Emily Hanakowitz, who had been a Cooper Union Art College student. She had her whole life been obsessed with eyes. She drew eyes. Cooper Union has a big Halloween parade as she made herself into a giant eyeball. And then she was Jewish American, and she went on a semester abroad in Israel and had a profoundly moving experience, as many people, including Ta-Nehisi Coates, have had, of suddenly becoming aware of the Palestinian situation and the injustice that was happening to them. And there was this attempted, I don't know if you remember this, but there was this attempted flotilla that was trying to block to go against the blockade of Gaza and take aid. And 6 or 7 people were killed. And Emily went to a protest the next day and was shot in the face with a tear gas canister that an IOF police officer had shot, and lost an eye. And so for me, it was almost just a human interest story that we come into. It was like, here's this person who's drawn eyes her whole life. Now she has one eye. And she was like trying to find her way back to art without the depth of perception, with only one eye. And of course I wrote about what had happened to her, but it wasn't really strongly positioning myself. I had not, no, I had been to Israel by then. And so the hammer just like came down on me. The Israeli consulate asked for it and met with my boss at the Village Voice. And, pressured them to try to fire me, and they didn't fire me. But that's part of Flak, right? Like, even if they don't fire you, it's like, this is really pressuring you not to talk about it again, and to frighten you into silence. And so then I wrote.
I'm so curious. What's the argument even from the Israeli consulate? Like, don't mention one of our soldiers half blinded this girl?
Yeah, it was like, he didn't call us. This is all based on her. I'm like, she didn't fucking rip out her own eye.
Did they dispute what caused her to lose her eye?
They disputed that it was their fault. They said I didn't even give them a chance to make their case, that I should have, and it never occurred to me. I mean, I love the Village Voice, and it has a place in had a place, in the American consciousness, but it never occurred to me that like I need to go to a foreign government to ask them for their side of the story about somebody who's had their eye shot out of their head. And so like, it was like made very clear to me by my boss, who didn't fire me, but like, oh, you really need to check with them and call them. And they try to be nice about it too. They're like, just call us, call and check in with us. We'd be happy to talk to you anytime. But it's an intimidation tactic. It's like a mafia tactic. The next time I wrote about Israel and Palestine, I didn't get in trouble, but other people did. And this comes back to like what is omitted is as powerful as anything else. There was a situation at the LGBT Center. This was around, I think, 2011, maybe 2012, I think 2011. And a group called Siege Busters, that was a group of mostly queer, but not all, and Jewish, Arab, Muslim, unreligious people together, working together to fight the apartheid in Israel. And they would, like many political groups, have a float in the Pride Parade. And as any group can, they rent a room in the center for $10 an hour, whatever nominal fee it is. And, they would meet for a few weeks, sometimes have talks, but mostly it's about how we're going to put our float together, getting everything together before Pride. So this pornographer named Michael Lucas, who is very funny because he was an Israeli porn impresario who was literally married to a South African diamond mine owner.
Oh boy!
Who had benefited a lot from South African apartheid. And he was known for doing inappropriate things with gay journalists. He sent me like an enormous box of porn that I like opened up on my desk next to my intern and was like, I closed it immediately before I knew it was
an unmarked,
yes.
no warning, just plain box of porn.
Yes, and I'm not like 20 DVDs in it. Like this was not something small of him. So he heard about this group and was like, I want them out of the center. And the center first said no. Then he called back, CC'd his husband, was like, all right, here are 100 friends who give money to the center, and we're all pulling our money unless you kick them out of the center. And they did. And I remember joking with a friend of mine who wrote at Gay City News, like this was a story that had everything in it. It had charges of Islamophobia, charges of anti-Semitism, charges of free speech, people being kicked out of a public square, a porn impresario with like a very publicly shown penis everywhere, and like in a city crawling with writers. It was just the Village Voice and Gay City News writing about, like no one else would touch it. And this is one of the things that happens because of Flak, because they scare people out of writing about anything. And then the third and most public way this happened to me was I was asked to give the graduation speech to the PhD students when I finished my doctoral studies at NYU. And I had not applied to give the speech. They had a contest, but I didn't apply. But I guess they didn't like who all applied, and they asked me to give it. And between the time I was asked to give it and when I gave it, I'll write about this in depth at another time. But a number of political things happened that are similar to what's happening now. And by the time it happened, like I knew I was going to address it in some way. NYU has a center in Tel Aviv, things had happened there. And so I added like 3 sentences to my prepared remarks where I said, and this is unfortunately very, very apropos of what happened today at Columbia. I said in the speech, like, I'm very proud of our students for Students of Justice in Palestine. I'm very proud of our chapters of Jewish Voices for Peace for being willing to stand up to the apartheid state government of Israel. And I said, like, as we go become professors, we must all do this. We must stand up for people being affected by Islamophobia and transphobia and anti-Semitism. And we must stand up with the most marginalized on our campus. And I said this is very apropos to today because the SJP and JVP chapters were just sanctioned at Columbia University just before I got on this call with you.
Sanctioned how? Like just one of these statements from the dean or what have you saying?
They were told they can't meet. They've been like deactivated as official clubs, at least for, I think, to the end of the year for protesting in violation of policy. So I gave the speech and it was very scary to give. And Ta-Nehisi Coates talked like also around the issue of Flak on Democracy Now! Last week about like how frightening it is because you know what's going to happen. It's like very, very scary. And it was very scary for me. And so a couple of days went by with not big stuff, but then it got into the press and eventually my PhD advisor never spoke to me again. And one of the members of my dissertation committee, who is a Black gay man, who is the dean, who'd asked me to give the speech, totally threw me under the bus, said that I was an anti-Semite, said I'd never implied that I was like a spy who had been trying to get this speech, even though I had never asked to give it. And then there was a real question about whether or not Northwestern was still going to hire me, because I was starting a week later. And another person, Steven Thrasher, also in Illinois, but at another university, UIC, had lost his job before he came over something he said about the 2014 attacks on Gaza and on the West Bank. And so I didn't even know if I was going to start my job. But then ultimately I did. After the president of the university and the provost at the time put out like a 2-page letter, my dean put out a 4-page letter disowning me publicly. And saying like all the reasons why he was so disappointed in me and like really trying to end my career. And then the 2 top people at Northwestern put out like a 2-page letter saying, Steven Thrasher is starting on June 1st. Then it was like 2 pages of, we think everything he says is disgusting, 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 disgusting. And the last line, but we believe in free speech, so he's starting. And again, like these public spankings are meant to try to humiliate me and, force me to still walk with my head high. But also like the real reason is for everyone else to see like he had his head cracked in, I should keep my fucking mouth shut.
Yeah.
And so that's the way.
You're making me think I got off easy with Bernie Sanders just saying she's not on the payroll. Hey, YouTube. Thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.